Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2016, presents INTERPHEX Live.
All right, good afternoon. Our first session this afternoon is going to be Bioprocess Intensification, doing more with less. Everybody wants to do more with less. And oh, by the way, you feel free to put on your suntan lotion out here at the Palace. It's going to get a little warm. Anyway, we have Ken Clapp, GE Healthcare, and Madhu Raghunathan with GE Healthcare as well. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with the basics. So process intensification, talk to me. What do we mean here?
Well, I guess we'll do a mic check there. Okay, that's good. Well, I guess from intensification point of view, there are two ways of doing it. You can look at upstream, you can look at downstream, or you can look at the entire stream. And I think both of us, each of us represents one element of it. I focus particularly on the upstream. It's really about getting more, like you said, with less, getting higher volumetric production from your bioreactor in this case. I'll focus on bioreactors. And that's really the basics of it. How you get there, what technologies you use, what procedures, what techniques, that is really up to the client, customer. We don't generally dictate that as GE. We're a supplier. We try to reflect what the industry's after with some guidance from our point of view, with products, with tools that we have the ability to offer, and recommendations based on whatever we see. Process intensification, you know, if you go back far enough, I mean, there was an attempt at this in the 90s, primarily because volumetric productivity being, let's say, protein below 1 milligram per liter was pretty common. And the only way you could get enough to actually do something with was to somehow grow the cells in a much higher density. So in sterilized in place, the concept of perfusion came out many years ago and was used considerably for a number of customers for a while until titers were able to be produced and the industrialization of cell culture was implemented. And then intensification sort of fell by the wayside. But now that we've got a much more competitive marketplace, it's really driving the need or the desire to get back into it. So with that said, I mean, intensification for the bioreactor, it's something that we look at, and we'll address some of it in some of the other questions, but it's really about just getting more out of that bioreactor, whether it's more per unit time or more out of a smaller volume. Like I said, there are many ways it could be done. Is whatever fits with the specific customer and the specific process.
So Madhu, I mean, bottom line is, it sounds to me like maybe some of this could be built in up front. So what do I do if I'm designing or redesigning it?
Yeah, you could build it up front, or you could take a look at it when you have any opportunity to kind of take a look at your process stream. Building it up front is easier and difficult because you kind of don't know what is the demand for your molecule going to be. But at the same time, when you're building it up front, you have a wider leeway to play with. And if you're kind of redesigning something, you have to work around your existing constraints. So it makes it a little bit more challenging from that perspective. But to kind of go back and kind of close the loop with what Ken said from an upstream perspective, it's the same thing. The concept is the same. You know, how do you kind of do more with what you have, or with even less than what you have, as a way of increasing your efficiency, as a way of increasing your productivity, your throughput. Ken was talking about perfusion as an example on the bioreactor side. You know, when it comes to downstream processing, some of the things that are kind of thrown about today or kind of looked at actively are things like, how can you automate your unit operations? Your unit operations around chromatography, for example, right? Can you use an automated column? Can you use an intelligent column as a way of getting your column in place and ready to run as quickly as possible? Can you use inline buffer formulation as opposed to kind of preparing buffers in tank farms and then shipping the tanks all the way around your facility, right? Can you use single-use technology? How can you apply more of single-use technology as a way of getting your processes turned around as quickly as possible, right? You can get more out of the door that way. How can you use more automation as a way of bringing everything together, right? And finally, not the least, but how can you kind of adopt more of continuous processing, continuous chromatography into your operations, both as a way of reducing your footprint, but also as a way of getting more out of your resin and more out of your equipment, which is exactly what this topic is about, right? So long answer short, I mean, there's different ways of doing this. There's different time points at which it can be done. I don't think there's a perfect answer or a perfect time to do this. You can always take a look at this and see what makes sense to do right now and then do what needs to be done.
Well, Ken, why don't I ask you this question then? So what characteristics should I be looking for in a process that makes them amenable to intensification?
Well, I think some of the key ones are it's a well-defined process, one that can be properly characterized so that the right methods, the right tools can be applied. In particular, a process where you've got process analytical tools available to you to actually be able to measure something and control it. I think that's a critical one. Something that has a manageable footprint. I think that also leads in a little bit to single use. Specific to the equipment, we'll get into that a little bit more, but the process characteristics, really it's about definable, the knowledge around it. And I think the other piece of it, which would be nice, which ties in the upstream and downstream, is a recognition of the interrelationship between upstream and downstream, not looking at the two as separate entities. Now, in some implementations, it's maybe easier to implement today on the upstream side or easier to implement on the downstream side. It's probably quite a bit more work, as most customers have found, to do the entire thing. So being able to do it piecewise would also be helpful, and that would be supported by a specific process type or how it's currently operated.
Well, how does this all play out in a regulatory environment then? I mean, Ken, what's the story on that? I mean, we all know that story. There's a great idea, there's good science, and then there's getting the permission to do it. So how does it all play out?
Yeah.
Don't both of you jump in at once now.
Let me jump in first, and then I know Ken has a few things to say. I'm not going to do this all the time, but I do want to close the loop on something that Ken said. I don't think there's any specific things that says this is a good time or this is the right process for which you can do process intensification. Like Ken was saying, if it's a well-defined process, you have a lot of knowledge around it, you have a lot of data around it, you have a way of controlling the process, it definitely makes process intensification a lot more easier, right? At the same time, from a process intensification perspective, you got to think about what is it that you're going to change, right? Is there an improved economic performance? Is there an improved performance benefit as a result of implementing this particular technology? And when you see that, that's the biggest trigger, if you will, for implementing the process intensification solutions, either piecemeal or as a whole. It would be really nice to implement it as a whole, but a lot of the times it's just challenging to be able to do this due to the constraints that you have. You have to keep your facility running. You have time constraints. You have other constraints that do not allow you to kind of implement all of the changes that you want at the same time, right? But then going back to your question from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of support from the regulatory authorities around some of the process intensification technologies, right? Let me take one specific example, continuous processing. What we've heard from the regulatory authorities is that the science is there, the willingness is there. It's encouraged because continuous processing, for example, allows for you to process proteins that are less stable in a better way, right? So from that perspective, it's a good thing. You can control your process in a better way. You can have a more stable process. But at the same time, I think the know-how that is there, at least on the downstream side for continuous processing, hasn't been fully built out yet, right? So it's always a question of risk versus reward. The reward is there, but are you willing to take that risk? And if so, you can move forward with it, right? The other challenge also is from a data perspective. If you look at all the biologics that's been manufactured today, we had some internal colleagues kind of take a look at it. It's about 10% of these biologics that are being commercially manufactured today that use continuous processing in one shape or the form for the manufacturing. And almost all of it is on the upstream side, right? So we are starting to see a shift, and probably it's more so on the upstream side because perfusion as a technology has been around for a much longer time, and therefore you have that know-how and you have that intimacy with that technology, as opposed to continuous processing, periodic countercurrent technology, or simulated moving bed technology on the downstream side, which is why you haven't seen as big an adoption, right? So I would say from a regulatory perspective, the impetus is definitely there. It's just a matter of getting comfortable with it and then showing the data, which is always asked. Show me the data, right? Show me the money and show me the data here. So if you can do that, if you have the backup, the knowledge that's needed to be able to make the transition, which is where your suppliers can help a lot as well, I think that's where you can start to pull the trigger on this.
Yeah, I think the regulatory bodies are good at providing guidance, but it comes down to the practitioners to actually do something with it. It's left up to individual companies to put into practice what makes sense for them, and some of that practice will be different based on the specific company, their size, the type of product, the market they serve. I think from a continuous processing point of view, there's been some initial work done in continuous processing of small molecules, non-biologics, that provide some level of structure or framework that the folks who make biologics will be able to adopt. I think the number of case studies, the amount of experience that's been expressed in the industry through either conferences or academic publications has been relatively small, especially for marketed drug, and I think that's a prerequisite to get both the industry and the regulatory body up to speed and really comprehend what can be done.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, from my standpoint, just so you know, one of the things I plagiarize from the bio side all the time is scale out rather than scale up. I'd rather make two of something than try to make a bigger one. Yeah. But having said that, so what are some of the limitations in the deployment of these technologies? That, give me an example. How do you overcome some of the limitations? And what is it? All right, do it this way. What's an example, and how do you overcome some of the limitations? Let's look at a practical example.
Yeah, I guess, again, just to take a snapshot of your question and look at it from a bioreactor perspective, I think from an intensification point of view, trying to grow more cells in the reactor, either for a longer period of time, just a larger number of cells, puts a lot more demand on the system. So I think, the solutions around today, what would you look for is you look for a product that's modular, that's flexible, and has the ability to adapt to that specific process. In particular, the ability to handle the extra load, the oxygen transfer, the power input to the system are two critical areas. And if you can get both of those characteristics in a bioreactor, you're well on your way to doing some level of intensification. Now, as most of the intensification processes I've heard about recently, even from the past, rely on some external device like a perfusion device, you also have to have the ability to interface to something externally, something that may not be your own as a supplier. So having that ability, being able to adapt to a third party's piece of equipment or a modification to your system, which is possible in some systems, that would support the implementation of intensification.
If I can add in a few comments as well. But before we do that, just show of hands, how many of you guys are either actively considering something like this or have done something about process intensification in the past?
So that means they're ready after this, they'll be implementing like crazy.
Yeah. Just to get an idea of where you guys are at. I mean, process intensification is very situation specific, right? You cannot just take a particular technology or a solution and say it's going to work for every single person in this room or every single person across the board, right? So that to me is if you will, one of the drawbacks of anything, right, including process intensification, is to understand where you are and understand where you want to go, and then carefully pick and choose the technologies or solutions that's actually going to make a difference to you, right? You got to be thinking about, as you start this journey, is this technology okay from a regulatory standpoint? Is this technology going to make a difference to me from a performance standpoint? Can I actually scale up this technology, right? What might work for me today may not work for me 6 months or a year down the line. Is this technology going to fit in with my facility constraints that I have today, right? How well is it going to work with something that I already have in place? what is the cost of actually doing a change over to this type of a technology? Do I have enough of a knowledge, know-how within my organization in order to be able to implement something like this, right? So at the big picture level, those are some of the things that I would think about, which could potentially act as a drawback depending on where you're at as a specific customer or as a client. Now, to give a specific example like you were asking, let's talk about single-use technology, right? I'm going to make it even more specific by talking about single-use technology from a chromatography perspective, right? So as a vendor, we actually have both clean and reuse columns that you would pack at your site, as well as pre-packed columns that are made available right off the bat. These are pre-packed, pre-verified, pre-sanitized. All you need to do is plug in your column and you're good to go, right? So why not use that technology all the time? The reason for that is that you want to look at it both from a performance perspective as well as from an economic perspective. Single-use technology, while it's really good, also has some drawbacks that you got to kind of wrap your heads around, right? From a logistics standpoint, is that single-use product or that consumable going to be there every single time that I need it? From a security of a supply standpoint, do I trust the vendor enough that I can completely move over to this technology? Do I need to evaluate this particular consumable every single time it comes into my facility? Integrity standpoint, how does that work out? I mean, can I trust that single-use bag well enough to be able to implement something like that into my facility? So you got to think through all of these different questions, right? The other aspect also is when you're looking at pre-packed columns, for example. They are more viewed as campaign use columns rather than as single-use columns, right? The reason for that is that the economics of those columns are at a certain point. We haven't reached the inflection point where you could start to use them as single-use products, right? So that's where I would kind of look at it and then say there's both benefits as well as drawbacks to each of these process intensification technologies depending on the stage that you are in, right? The scale of manufacturing. Are you a single product, multi-product facility? What is your future ambition? What are your other facility constraints and so on? And therefore, I would pick and choose the technologies that make sense to you at that point of time.
Well, let me ask you this. What's a success? Give me an example of a successful implementation of something like that. Single-use technology. What would be, can we talk about that a little more? In your experience.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, I think, success is defined in a lot of different ways for different customers and different customer-vendor collaborations. I think from our perspective, when we look at success, it's, does a particular project, move forward our knowledge about either the bioprocess, our customer base, or in particular intensification? Does it allow the customer to achieve the level of productivity or operational excellence that they're after for that particular choice? So I think that there aren't as many as there will be, because I think we're still getting into the beginning stages of this intensification piece from a practical point of view. But from experience with customers that we've had, where we've had to fit, let's say, within an automation framework, and I can't go into specifics, but fitting with a specific automation framework, data management piece, a footprint or a form factor for a specific facility, those are all different, right? And I think that one of the things that we still see across the board in single use is there's still a reasonable level of customization based on the type of process, the type of customer, and the type of use. And intensification has the ability with single use to be able to standardize some of those down to the unit operation level and the connectivity level, not just from connectivity of the process, but also for data, to make those a little bit easier so that success is a little bit broader and more general for a broader set of customers. But like I said, it's really quite dependent, but being able to fit into those facility places, being able to handle the data, automation, as Madhu said earlier, is a big piece of managing that data. So that defines a level of success today.
So Madhu, is it continuous process and intensification? Do you see these playing off of each other, or are they two separate subjects?
I would say they're absolutely not separate subjects. They're definitely interrelated. continuous processing has a big role to play when it comes to process intensification, right? So like we talked about, process intensification is basically how can I do more with less? And continuous processing is exactly that when it comes to downstream applications, right? So what you want to do with continuous processing is, or with any of your processes is, how do you ensure that you're using your equipment as much as possible? How do you ensure that you can have your equipment turned around as quickly as possible? How do you ensure that your volumetric productivity is high as possible, like Ken was saying before, right? All of these kind of lead to many different areas, one of which is continuous processing, right? Continuous processing, at least on the downstream side, it's a simple thought, right? It's a way of having a merry-go-round way. It's an arrangement where you have your columns kind of sorted out in a merry-go-round way in order to ensure that you can maximize the productivity of your equipment and of your columns at the same time. You're loading one column, and at the same time, you're reloading off of another column, right? And your equipment, your system is working both the columns at the same time, right? So both from a system efficiency perspective, but also from a resin utilization perspective, it plays to the angle of process intensification. So I would say they're very much interrelated and tied and go hand in hand with regards to what you want to achieve from an efficiency standpoint.
So what I'm hearing is I got to look at my scale, I got to look at my facility type, I got to look at my layout, I got to look at my volume, and then I come up with a strategy. Is that kind of the way you got to look at it for intensification? I mean, it doesn't sound to me, it sounds to me like it's holistic more than like, gee whiz, let me turn up the speed or something.
Yeah, well, I think part of the the way things are made today, the majority of products are not made in an intense or intensified mechanism. I think there's a lot of history behind that. There's been a lot of, let's say, reticence to use certain apparatus like a perfusion device, especially in the single-use space. But I think the market pressures are making it more of a requirement to do it. And in order to look at that, you have to look at that as a starting point. If you have a business, if you're an end user company, if you have a business that's very competitive, and it's absolutely imperative for you to be successful by having an intensified process, then that's probably one of the very first questions you have to answer. If you can continue to operate the way you do today, which is either through a batch or fed batch type of mechanism, then okay, then there's really no reason to invest in it, no reason to look at it as an alternative. Because certainly today, shifting to an intensified process or continuous processing, it's going to be different than what people are used to. And there'll be a significant learning curve. It'll probably be more costly the first couple of times they do it, especially at different stages. So to be able to identify what that economic value is going to be one of the very first issues. I know that sometimes we get involved early enough in a specific process where the economics of all of that is looked at sequentially. So you take a look at the media preparation. What does that take? Because now you're talking about potentially feeding this device very refined media with very specific requirements over a defined period of time, more specifically to get that productivity out of it. Then the bioreactor size. What size does it have to be? Which gets back to the discussion around footprint and your comment about scale out or scale up. Those are fundamental design decisions and concepts that have to be fleshed out at the very beginning. So then you take it from that point of view, and if the organization that you're dealing with is not that familiar with integrating process development between upstream and downstream, and it's more of a thrower with a fence, you've got to address that issue as an operational issue. So those are some of the big challenges. If the outside the process, can the company attack it? Is it an economic reason to do it? Do they have the culture to be able to adopt it? And will the market tolerate their next product to be developed that way?
Okay. You have something there?
Yeah, I mean, if I just take a step back, right? This industry has seen a lot of growth over the past 10, 15 years. We started, in the early 2000s, we were probably about, biologics output from a dollar perspective was about $20, $30 billion. Last year, we probably ended the year at about $200 billion in terms of total biologic sales, right? So a lot of the growth, but along with any good thing, there's also bad things, right? Or challenges. The challenges are that a lot of the companies are trying to kind of do the same molecules. We were doing an industry study in one of the emerging markets where we looked at 100 different projects from a whole bunch of customers. And of those 100 different projects, all of them put together were off of 6 molecules, right? They were all biosimilars. Almost all of them are trying to do the same thing, right? So when you're doing that, when there's a lot of cost pressure coming from both from the government side as well as because of competition, you have to start thinking about different ways of driving efficiency and productivity into the ways in which you manufacture your biologics, right? As a way of driving down your costs and making sure that you can be profitable now and use that as a base for doing what you need to do in the future, right? To that end, process intensification is really, really critical. And to kind of what Ken said, just because it's there doesn't mean that you go ahead and implement it, right? You got to look at where you are and say, does this make sense for me, right? One of your previous questions, Russ, was about some examples of where process intensification has been implemented, right? I can give you a couple of examples when it comes to downstream processing. Column packing, for example. Column packing historically has been viewed more as an art than a science, right? You either get it or you don't get it. If I pack a column, it might take me, I don't know, a couple of months to do it, right? Versus some of you guys might be really experts at that, right? So do we want to have such a disparity in turning something around, especially in an industry that's such science-driven as this? So the direction that we're moving towards when it comes to column packing, at least when you're using reusable columns, is more automated and intelligent columns where you can shave off as much as 50% of your time that it takes to turn around a column if you kind of implement the historical ways, right? So that's one example of where process intensification is really beneficial. The other example is something that I kind of touched upon earlier, which is inline conditioning or buffer formulation on the fly, right? Do you really want to have a whole bunch of tank farms kind of feeding up to each and every step of your process, in a really inefficient way? Is that the best usage of your facility? Probably not, right? So when you start to implement something like a buffer formulation on the fly, which is basically, taking your stock concentrates of acid, base, water, and then salt, and then manufacturing the buffer that you need just at the right time when you need it, you can shave up to 50–60% of your footprint that you're currently using when it comes to the space needed for preparing buffers, right? And it reduces the buffer that you need to prepare. I mean, we've seen examples where there's almost like a 10–20-fold reduction in the amount of buffer, in the volume of buffer that you're manufacturing, right? So things like that can make a huge shift depending on where you are and where you want to go, right? So if your intention is that you're kind of doing a couple of products in your facility, you want to have the flexibility, you want to have the capability to go up to you want to add more products onto your pipeline, something like this might be, the make or break decision in order to do what you need to do as a facility, right? So that's where I would kind of tie everything together and say, take a look at this. The toolbox is available. Depending on where you are, you can pick and choose the entire toolbox or pick and choose one or two of them that kind of make sense for you depending on where you are and what your constraints are.
So let me ask you this question then. I mean, obviously, we had the guys in here before and they were talking about AR, VR, and aiding people and operators and, making sure the guy on the floor and the guy doing. It sounded to me like we were trying to get some of that burden off of him. So, I mean, what I'm hearing here is sounds like we're going to put a big strain on our operator tank. So how does this all play into that? You know what I'm saying? In other words, I think the more with less doesn't always work with people. So how does that kind of work out? What does that do to the workforce? Is that a reasonable question? I mean,
no, I think it's definitely a reasonable question. I think that's probably a bias most people have when they hear do more with less or do more with what you got. I think that's often been the case. But I think that, depending on what the implementation is, like I said, it's really a snapshot of what the customer is, what that environment is. This industry doesn't tolerate a change in efficacy or safety. So regardless of what we implement, that has to be maintained first and foremost. So, what that would ultimately mean from the standpoint of end users is if they can't do their job, that drug's not going to get approved. It's not going to make it to the market, right? So there would have to be some extra effort made in this area to improve operator training. Make sure you choose tools that are specific that allow, or let's say reduce that burden, or you compensate for training or the use of that technology. I think that's one of the other things. If you look at where we are today in the industry, a lot of what we do is based on batch or fed batch, and it is a different way of operating. If you take continuous processing with whatever technologies are available and you apply that across the board, you're eventually going to lead to what's been broadly discussed as a closed system, which would remove a lot of requirements off of the end user, the operators. Not only that, but along that pathway with the implementations that we've got today with either upstream or downstream mechanisms, the ability to get data into the process, from the process into the hands of quality, to be able to potentially do in-process release with the right data. Again, I think it relieves the burden on the end users and the facility and the overall operation. But it takes the proper application of the technologies and the appropriate training for the people who actually have to use it. And that's not just the operators, but it will also change how the supply chain's managed, how purchasers are going to buy raw materials. It's going to change how data gets integrated into MES systems and ERP systems. It really has the potential to change a considerable amount of how we operate, and that's why it's got to be the right technology for the right business at the right time.
Okay, having said that, upstream, downstream, I mean, how do you get this to harmonize then? Is it one better than the other, one more important? Help me out.
No, not really. It just kind of depends on what your starting point is and what your ambition is. I said this earlier that I'm not going to go back to a previous question, but I got to go back here.
Well, you can do that. Yeah, you're allowed.
So to what Ken was saying, that's absolutely right. The biggest thing here is that it's a culture shift. It's a mindset shift, right? The way we think about processes today is that the process is the product, right? Once you got something in terms of your process, don't touch it, right? Irrespective of whether it's good or not, whether it's efficient or not, you do not want to be touching the process, right? What we kind of need to start thinking about is moving from GMP to something that's BMP, which is a better manufacturing process. How can you ensure that you understand the variables that go into your process and define your process in a way that's adaptive to some of these changes that are going to happen, right? So that is the real way where you're going to have, to Ken's point, a way in which your output quality, your end quality of your product is going to meet the real strict tolerances that we impose on products coming out of this industry, right? If you look at the quality cost of the cost of goods, what I mean by that is your cost of good of manufacturing your product has a certain quality cost associated with it, right? Due to failed batches or due to the fact that you may have to repack a column. Our rough estimate today is that quality cost of goods is around 4 to 5%, right? So is there a way you can drive that down? Could you drive that down to 1%? Could you drive that down to 0%? And that's not going to happen if we continue the path that we are on today, where we have a lot of manual interaction and non-intensified processes as part of the workflow, right? What you really need is more intensified, more automated process implemented into your facility, implemented into your ways of working as a way of driving down your quality cost of goods, and as a way of driving up your productivity, efficiency, and quality of the product, right? So to that end, I don't think it matters where you start from. If you start looking at the upstream processes, due to the fact that perfusion as a technology has been around for a long time, has been kind of accepted by customers, and is kind of making a comeback, if you will, we are already starting to see, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Ken, starting to see 3-4 grams per liter titers on commercial processes on the upstream side.
No,
Sound
correct.
about right?
Yeah, they're constantly going up, yeah.
Yeah. And on experimental process designs, they're going up to about like 6-7 grams a liter, right? So that also places a great pressure when it comes to downstream processes in order for them to be more intensified. You can always, there's 2 different ways of doing anything. You can do it the right way, or you can just, add more and more capacity on your downstream side to keep up with what's going on the upstream end of your operations, right? But the right way to do it on the downstream side is to intensify your process by implementing the toolbox techniques that we talked about as a way of ensuring that you're actually getting more for less, right? And with the other left out capital, you can use it for other things like getting out more new molecules, or doing far more cooler things on your facility that you wouldn't be able to do today, because you're kind of doing it in a less efficient way in terms of how things are getting done.
So maybe I got it backwards. But, so if I want to do process intensification, it sounds to me like I'm going to be more heavily relying on my automation and my sensor arrays and stuff like this. I mean, what I'm saying is, this could be the tipping point right there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yes and no, right? Automation is something that cuts across all of the process intensification techniques and solutions. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you're going to live in a fully automated world, right? So let's take a specific example of column packing, right? Column packing is a key operation that needs to be done for all of your chromatographic purification steps. Historically, the way it's been done is through flow packing or pack-and-place technologies, which place a heavy emphasis on the operator having the knowledge and being able to make gut feel decisions when packing a column. Is that a good thing? Maybe, maybe not, right? What happens if that operator moves away, the operator retires, and you have a bunch of new guys who don't necessarily have that experience to pack the column just the way that it was packed by the previous operator, right? So that's where automation can actually help, right? Imagine if you could just press a button and your entire column packing operation is done, right? All you need to do then is to wheel the column into your suite and then start the purification operation. Makes your life a lot more easier, right? And when you start implementing technologies like PAT or real-time product release, it doesn't quite gel with kind of the manual way of doing things. When you start automating things, that's when you start to see the real benefit of process analytics technologies, real-time product release, straight through processing, which is a way of eliminating holding tanks in between unit operations, right? So I would say automation is an enabler, and I don't think we should kind of look at it as some black box that we should be scared of.
Yeah, but it's a black box if you haven't made the investment. That's kind of the point I'm making. Most guys, so Ken, most people have this stuff in place, or is this?
Well, yeah, again, I think it's, when you look at a company who is looking at process intensification as a mechanism for improving their manufacturing capability, most of them have some form of automation that's interconnected to MES and ERP systems that allows them to get the most out of the overall operation of the facility. When you look at the data, most of the sensors are available in industry today. If you look at a bioreactor example in an intensified process, you have an external device that you've got connected. It's gonna increase the cell density. You're measuring pressures. You're measuring flows of the fluids. You're looking at potentially weights if you're doing a cell bleed. So all those technologies are already there, and most customers already have those in one form or another. And that's also true in development, because remember, a lot of these things are still going to come through development before they get to manufacturing, and they'll have to develop an intensified process first. Other sensors, say specifically moving some sensors to single use, that's probably a little bit more difficult, but most of the sensors I just mentioned, like pressure and flow, are already available in single use, which allows that to be implemented from a technology point of view.
All right. Before you close the loop again, let me just ask you a simple question. We got 5 minutes, and I want to know what's next. All right, guys, we talked about this, but I think what we found so far is, you know, when we got our experts up here, what we want to know is, okay, process intensification. What's the next one? Is it continuous process? Is it automation? I mean, what do you see happen? And then you can close whatever loop you like.
Yeah, I don't think it's a process intensification isn't an endpoint, right? It's actually a journey. And to that end, you could do all of these things that we talked about. You could do one of these things, but the greatest benefit is in when you look at it holistically, both from the upstream perspective as well as the downstream perspective, and start to pull things in where you can start driving up your efficiency, start driving up your productivity, start driving down your turnaround times, start driving down your cost of manufacturing, right? So given that it's a journey, to me, there's no end point to this journey. You can keep progressing on this, to the extent that you want, to the extent where you kind of see the benefits start tailing off. What comes after this is, things like continuous processing, a way of having a completely connected process as opposed to having disconnected islands or disconnected units of continuous processes. Integrating or implementing more intelligence into your process, right? Through sensors, through process analytical technology, through real-time product release, things like this as a way of taking process intensification to the next step, right? So that's the short answer to what you just asked. I don't know if Ken wants to add anything more to what I just said.
No, I would certainly agree that it's part of a journey, right? I mean, it's whatever the next right thing needs to be for the specific industry and what producers have to do to respond to market pressures. Intensified process, continuous processing. I think having some real published success stories from end user companies, either on the upstream or the downstream or even combined, I think that's what's next, because it's not really adopted that much to really say that it's fully embraced by the industry. And it will change. It'll require those changes in training, which I also mentioned. It's going to be specific to particular customers' cultures, and the regulatory bodies are going to have to deal with it as it becomes more and more adopted. Having a closed system where it's essentially like a stainless steel plant using single-use technologies to go from end to end, from start to finish, I think that's what some of the pieces of next. And if you take it maybe to the next extreme, it's personalized medicine at some level.
To just touch upon the fact, I'm gonna try and talk about two things at the same time here. Going back to your question or your thinking around automation as a black box, and automation again is not just a endpoint, right? It's a journey as well, because there's different ways of doing automation. You could have islands of automation where your different unit operations are working on different automation platforms even. You could have automation where your automated systems are connected back to your MES ERP systems, like Ken was saying earlier, where you can start to get data off of your processes and see how you've been doing from a historical standpoint. You could have connected unit operations that are automated, where you could use a recipe to kind of run your unit operation in a fully automated way. Or you could automate the entire factory. You could have one master software running your entire facility, right? So that, again, kind of ties back to the point that this is a journey. It's not really saying, I'm going to press a button and therefore my facility is process intensified. It doesn't quite work like that, right? So it's up to you to pick and choose what you want to do. It doesn't have to be scary. You can start by doing things that are low-hanging fruits, and once you start to get more data around what you've done, once you start to feel more comfortable, you can keep climbing the stairs, and then starting to get to that end point or that end goal where you've kind of completely intensified your facility, right? So that's the way I would kind of look at it and kind of summarize the discussion that we had today. That process intensification is a toolbox. It's not a binary thing. It's not a 0 or a 1 thing. It's something that you take discrete steps along, and you can stop at any point of time once you kind of feel that the benefits aren't starting to add up, or the risks are not worth the reward that you're starting to see, right? But I would say pick and choose the ones that you're comfortable with, depending on where you are, where you want to end up. And if you start to think about it that way, I think there's a lot of progress and a lot of outcomes that you can achieve as a result of implementing this into your facility.
One of the things I've always been amazed with was when people either put in automation or PAT, unless you have the basic process knowledge necessary, all that does is lock your product into a zone of failure anyway.
Yeah.
I never forget it. One of the first jobs we got, and guy told me, I said, well, it fails for this reason. He said, I don't understand how it could. We have PAT. So, well, I'm not, you know what I mean? I mean, how do you feel that makes you fail-proof? If you never did the background work, and that if you never did the background work and you never set the process spec right,
yeah.
You put a whole bunch of hardware in to hold it where it is, all you've done is assure yourself of failure.
Yeah.
So to me, that's where I'm at. As long as we understand where we're at and that automation, none of this stuff is a savior. It goes without saying. You have to understand the process.
Yeah.
With that, is there any other further questions? I want to thank you guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks, everyone.
Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2016, presents INTERPHEX Live.